All right, so let's roll into another game, staying in the West. Auburn and Mississippi State. We talked a lot about Miss State last week. You had some reservations about them going up against Georgia because you thought LSU might just be that bad. They kind of confirmed that against Syracuse. I have a feeling that if we saw LSU-Syracuse early in the morning, we would feel a lot worse about Miss State's chances than we knew watching the game because they played at the same time. So there's a lot of fans that didn't see Auburn just steamroll Missouri. That could have been expected. And then we talked a little bit about how Auburn beat Mercer a lot worse than that 24-10 score they showed. So let's talk a little bit first about Mississippi State. Where are they mentally coming into this game, and what did you see against Georgia that might be more the same against Auburn or completely different regarding matchups?
Well, Mississippi State is kind of what I thought they were in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. Maybe, the score wasn't really necessarily that far off from a point differential from what I predicted. And I know, again, a lot of people probably take that offense to that one way or the other, but it just kind of is what it is sometimes. And I hope people at least respect the fact that I think I had this like 41-17 or something, that if I predicted it large and it was large, that I'm not dogging your team. I'm just trying to call out what it is. And Mississippi State has a greatly improved front seven. They have a much more active front four. I don't think they have a tremendous amount of depth in the front four, but they have an active and disruptive front four. I think they still have significant issues in the back seven defensively that showed up big time. And I think offensively, they have a little bit of wiggle, I guess, if you want to call it that, but they rely more on trickeration than a straight offense. And my biggest prediction coming out of the LSU game was, and I think both of us saw this, Mississippi State had success against LSU not by running a traditional offense, but by exploiting problems in LSU's defense. And we noted, and I think it got misinterpreted a couple times, and I said Keith Mixon was the main receiver. I meant in that game, obviously Gray was the main receiver overall, but what was really concerning to me was the fact that Keith Mixon dominated the reception total and the yardage total in the LSU game as a 5'8" receiver. Mixon's an interesting target. You get a lot of things with him, but a lot like Isaiah McKenzie for Georgia last year, you really shouldn't have a guy that is that far off the prototypical receiver that's dominating your yardage and reception totals. And what we saw against LSU was really a handful of busted plays on play action. They were driven, one, by the fact that LSU's front four and front seven had guys getting knocked out of the game, and they had some injuries before the game, and they've lost a lot of guys, and they really couldn't stop the rush that effectively, and they really just weren't very disciplined. They were overly aggressive in the back seven. Georgia was a lot more disruptive, so all that play action stuff, it's great, but play action passes do not work if people are getting into the backfield readily, because you end up taking sacks. Saw that a little bit, but we also saw, I think, probably astutely noted that perhaps Georgia was going to be as discombobulated as they had been against Notre Dame, but they still weren't nearly as discombobulated as LSU was. And they forced Nick Fitzgerald to be more of a traditional pocket passer. I know that's a huge kind of cliche to say, but it's true. And Nick Fitzgerald is far too inconsistent to be a traditional pocket passer. And once he was forced into that role and actually had to deal with a real pass rush, he averaged 2.9 yards per attempt. They only had 83 yards on 29 attempts. And that's just not going to get it done. I mean, they actually ran the ball pretty successfully, 4.8 yards a carry. It's rare to see a team get 4.8 yards per carry in a ball game and score 3 points. But that's what happens when your passing game, in this case, it was, I think, worse than normal. I don't think it's going to necessarily be that bad every week, but they're going to be really affected by the pass rush, because I don't think Fitzgerald, frankly, makes great decisions. I don't think he's a very accurate passer. If he has time to set his feet and make throws or make the easy throw, he's good. But if he actually has to stand in a pocket and deliver balls on a rope with accuracy, he's going to struggle. And I think that's really what we saw out of Mississippi State in the Georgia game. I should also note, by the way, that the biggest thing in the Georgia game, too, and the reason that got so out of hand is, like I said, Mississippi State's pass defense was 80th or worse in almost every category, or every conceivable way you want to look at it. They were about 90th in pass defense last year. And I didn't really think that probably had improved too much, be outside of pass rush, and sure enough, they gave up 17 yards per attempt. Only threw, I mean, Georgia threw 12 passes. They scored 2 touchdowns and had 201 yards, and that's how that score got so out of whack.
So, Noah, in our kind of quick review of Auburn last week, we talked about how we kind of gave a not so fast on everybody that's shorting Auburn at this point in the year because of their offensive struggles against Clemson and follow up with Mercer. I don't know that there's a lot you can glean from beating Missouri that bad since, Missouri State scored or had just about as much offensive success as Auburn did. But can we take away from this at least that there could have been maybe I'll say it like this: we could have learned a lot about Auburn if they struggled offensively against Missouri, but there's not much we can learn outright with them having success against Missouri.
Well, I think that's very true. Look, the same thing happened last year, right? We talked about that quite a bit. Cameron Petway, Darius Geis got a tremendous amount of credit as elite rushers, in large part over stretches that involve the Arkansas game and Missouri game for both of them. Missouri is almost historically bad. Okay, I mean they're not just bad or struggling or a bad Missouri team. This is a team that, frankly, without sugarcoating it, looks like they've given up, and they're terrible, and they're terrible in every shape, form, or fashion. So, at the end of the day, they averaged like 5 yards a carry against Auburn, or Auburn averaged 5 yards a carry against Missouri. That was kind of skewed by how much they were just trying to run the clock out late. They pretty much did what they wanted to do, and I think more importantly, Stidham kind of did what he wanted to do in that game. So I think it's worth.
Well, he was playing a Big 12 defense, so he felt comfortable.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of truth to that, honestly, and just in terms of he knew he could throw the football and be confident that nobody was going to make a break on the ball and that he wasn't going to have a guy in his face. I mean, it makes a big impact, and you see sometimes people struggle without it. But I mean, I don't know. I think we talked about it before. I don't think Auburn is problematic as people think offensively, or is bad offensively, I guess I should say. The Mercer game got blown out of proportion. I think it's worth talking about for a minute. Stidham was 27 of 32 in that Mercer game for 364 yards, which is 8.9 yards per attempt. That's the same yard per attempt average and completion percentage that Clemson's Bryant had against Kent State in their opener where they blew out Kent State. I think there was a lot more concern that Petway only averaged 3.8 yards per carry. Frankly, I'm still slightly concerned that Auburn didn't run the ball better against Missouri in that game. I mean, they had Martin averaged 8.2 yards per carry. Stove had a couple big runs, but Kerryon Johnson only averaged 2.7 yards per carry. So there's still not really overwhelming teams running the football. But the Mercer game was just a 5 turnover game, really, and that's why that game stayed close. I don't take anything away from it. They outgained Mercer 510 yards to 246. So I think that's really being blown out of proportion. What I think about Auburn is got some limitations on what they can and can't handle. Their offensive line is frankly not anywhere close to what it has been the past few years, when it has consistently been one of the better offensive lines in the conference. It's just not there. It has some serious limitations. And all that considered, I think Stidham is getting a bad rap. I actually think he's a pretty good quarterback and doing a pretty good job. The Clemson game, the spotlight was on. Everybody sort of panicked a little bit, but no quarterback can operate with that kind of pressure. Absolutely none. I said at the beginning of the season, when we previewed all the teams to start the year, I have repeatedly called this the year of the receiver because I think the receivers are quietly going to determine the season. Auburn's receiving core, I didn't really believe in then. I don't really believe in it now. I think the receiving core is making him look a lot worse because they can't get separation. And when you don't have separation and you don't have time, bad things happen. But when they're not playing a team that has a very elite pass rush like Clemson, they're going to suddenly start looking a lot better, especially if they can maintain balance. So that's kind of my opinion on Auburn. And maybe in a second we can take to, I think the biggest thing for them is just not being overly predictable and trying to maintain balance by, making sure they do vary the run and the pass rather than getting too pass happy one way or another, which is kind of a problem for both
And
Lindsey
not
and Malzahn.
only pass happy, but specifically within those pass plays, not just calling shot after shot after shot with everything deep verts. Like that was the issue against Clemson. I'm going to harp on it all year until I see something change in a game that matters. But part of that is to, getting a quarterback comfortable, like you talked about, and I think he's done that. But now Auburn's facing again a defense that, like you said, they've got all issues on offensive line, but you've also noted that Miss State has an improved front seven, so and especially their ability to get after the quarterback. So we can talk about that, but I do, before we talk about that, want to talk about the fact that Mississippi State 37-7 over LSU, and Fitzgerald had a big day. Aeris Williams had a big day. And then they run into a really good defense in Georgia. Defense that was good last year, looks to be even more athletic and improved this year. Putting the Mississippi State defense against the maybe struggling Auburn offense aside, is this kind of bad news for Miss State running into another maybe equally as talented and more, well, this is a long intro to a question, but I don't see Auburn's defense as talented and as athletic as Georgia's, but probably more disciplined. So is Mississippi State going to have some of the same issues that they had last week with an Auburn defense this week?
I think they kind of are. Auburn and Georgia are very different. Now, I kind of gushed on Georgia in the Mississippi State Georgia preview. I think they're as talented as just about anybody in a lot of ways. They're too young. They're not just inexperienced. They're young. They're underdeveloped. The guys aren't big enough. Georgia's biggest problem is that I think you can push them around, and if you can do that, it negates a lot of things they want to do. I don't think Mississippi State, frankly, had the offensive line to do it. They still had a fair amount of success on the ground, but I think some teams, cough Alabama, if there's a national championship game, are going to be able to bully Georgia a little bit. Auburn is a very different team this year. They don't have a phenomenal pass rush. They have a decent pass rush, but they're really just big and physical in the front seven, and they have an experienced secondary that I'm not sure that they're necessarily elite, but they're solid. And in college football, solid in the secondary is frankly probably very good. Most teams don't really have a secondary that doesn't have some sort of major deficiency, and I don't think Auburn does. I think they're solid on the back end, and they get enough push on the offensive line that you can't run the ball very well, which means they can be creative with their blitzes and their coverage schemes. So I think that's sort of, how things differ is where Georgia was constant disruption and Lorenzo Carter in the backfield every third play. Auburn is going to be a lot less of that, but it's going to be the line of scrimmage just moving backwards on every snap. And if that's the case, that play action stuff they tried against LSU isn't going to function. And whereas in the Georgia game, it didn't function because Fitzgerald would get pressured before he get the pass off. In the Auburn game, it's not going to function because Auburn's just going to drop 7 in coverage, bring 4, and know eventually they're going to get Fitzgerald, and they're just going to keep a spy on him. And it's going to be less big impact play, less flashy, but it's going to be kind of the same result due to the slow death. They're going to take a toll. I think what's way more interesting, honestly, is whether Auburn's offense can sort of get out of the morass. And if you're willing, I'd like to touch on that a little bit in relation to the Clemson game to kind of explain where, when we talk about the 4 verts concept, they've had problems.
Yeah, since you just called my question boring and said the question that I intentionally avoided is more interesting, let's go ahead and talk about it.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. Okay, so this was sort of the point that I'd written up, which is why I wanted to talk about it. Auburn in the Clemson game, their main issue was they really had struggled with maintaining good down and distance, and they struggled with predictability that allowed Clemson to get a tremendous amount of pressure. In the second half, 4 of 8 first downs were an inside zone run to Cameron Petway. So on first down, Clemson really kind of kept everybody to the line of scrimmage and sort of attacked it. 3 of the 4 runs gained only 1 yard, and the 4th run got a 4 yard. So everything was 4 yards or less. Most of them were a yard or less gain. So that was half the first down plays in the second half, okay? But in the second half, the only time Petway got the ball were those plays on first down or 1 yard or less to go. And I think they were all 1 3rd and 1 or all 4th and 1 sort of play. So it was either first down or it was 1 yard, 3rd and 1. It was the only time Petway got the ball. They never ran the ball on 2nd and 10 or 2nd and 6. And what that did is it made them exceptionally predictable. And when you never run your main running back on 2nd and long the entire game, it lets the opponent, in this case Clemson, know that they can drop 7 into coverage. So Auburn would drop back to pass. They would be in max protect. So at one point, Auburn had 7 guys in protection. They had a tight end and a running back in protection, which leaves only 3 guys out in a pattern. Clemson brought 4, and they dropped 7 in coverage. So Auburn only had 3 receivers with 7 guys covering them. It was impossible for Stidham to find anybody open, and he ended up getting sacked. And this sort of snowballed. And I think, though, that there's an opportunity for them to break this tendency, be a lot more successful. In the first half against Clemson, they'd broken this tendency 5 times, and that being that they ran the ball on second and long. And 3 of the 5 times they ran the ball, they got a first down. And on the situations I talked about, which was first down or extremely short yardage, Petway only averaged 2.9 yards per carry against Clemson. But on the 5 carries where they broke tendency, he averaged 4.8 yards per carry. I say all this because it's really a problem that both Chip Lindsey and Gus Malzahn have had in the past. We talk about this over and over again, but Gus Malzahn came down to the Springville High School, Arkansas offense. If you remember Arkansas, when he came as an offensive coordinator, they fired him because he refused to run the ball with Felix Jones, Peyton Hillis, and Terry McFadden. So he really does like to throw the ball way more than he should. Chip Lindsey has a reputation for loving to throw the football. And I think they kind of got away from the fact that they're a run-first team. But when they realized it in the second half, and I don't know if Malzahn took over or what, but they completely failed to do anything to take account for their predictable consistencies. They got extremely predictable on what they were going to do. Venables was able to clamp down. He knew when to bring pressure when he should, and he knew when to drop guys in coverage. And, outside of as I said, there were 2 drives where Auburn broke tendency running the ball in the Clemson game. Those 2 drives were the first 2 drives of the game, and they were the longest drives of the game, 15 and 8 plays respectively. After the first 2 drives, they never broke tendency again. And the longest drive in the game for the remainder of the game was 6 plays. So, that's kind of a long little mini rant, which we do occasionally, but I think it was really kind of useful and interesting information that, to me, Auburn, to take the next step offensively, has got to break tendency. They have to be willing to run the ball on 2nd and long so they're not in 3rd and 10. I think sometimes Petway and Kerryon Johnson are good enough backs that they're going to get a first down on 2nd and 10 if the other team doesn't know it's coming. And they've got to be willing to throw the ball on first down so they don't know that that's coming. And if they can break tendency, I think suddenly they can sort of turn the corner and become a much more effective offense than we've seen to this point.
And I think they're a little more multiple when they've got Kerryon Johnson healthy, because he does a little bit, so he can do the Wildcat thing, which I hate and I'm not even going to talk about, but he's also a good back in space, and he's a change of pace back from the battering ram with Petway. For me, I think the concern on one side is Gus Malzahn. Everybody knows it. He's been stubborn in the past offensively. I'm not convinced that he didn't call or at least direct the plays against Clemson. But I am encouraged that not only were they able to do some things offensively against Missouri that they hadn't shown all year, but it looked like Stidham was really comfortable. And I asked you last week about Mississippi State facing a quarterback in Fromm or Eason and how good they were relative to what we've seen them play in the recent past. Is it fair to say that Stidham is a better quarterback, even though Fromm's getting all the hype, he threw the flea flicker? Is it fair to say that Stidham's a better quarterback, and it's going to be in some ways a bigger challenge for this Mississippi State defense?
I think that probably is fair to say, honestly. I know Fromm gets a lot of credit for being a gamer. I think Stidham got limited in one game due to the offensive problems with their offensive line. I think Fromm has a much better receiving core and skill position talent, frankly. I know Auburn's backs, Kerryon Johnson, Cameron Petway, very good backs, okay? Nick Chubb and Sony Michel are NFL tailbacks and clear-cut NFL tailbacks. So Fromm has a lot of things at his disposal that Stidham doesn't have, but I think Stidham may be a better quarterback in a lot of ways, and I think he's a much more dangerous downfield passer. And Mississippi State really struggled last year defending the deep ball. So I don't know if this will be the game where Auburn takes a step forward and their young receivers like Craig Myers really kind of comes out of their shell, but I think there's a chance of it. And with guys like Stove, Auburn has a lot of speed. So if they can keep Mississippi State off balance, I think they can put some points on the board. I don't think they're as explosive as Georgia, frankly. I think Georgia's skill position talent is just better. But I do think that Stidham creates more complications because there is, maybe he may be of a less of a gamer play to play, but he has more capability, and there's a bigger playbook that you have to account for when he's in the ball game.
I'm going to go back to Mississippi State offense one more time before we get into the numbers. Auburn facing a little different quarterback in Fitzgerald, who has shown when he's clicking can make any throw on the field, and he can move the ball with his feet. Does that give any glimmer of hope relative to the type of defense that Auburn plays for Mississippi State in this game? I know we're killing Mississippi State on the heels of this game, and we kind of killed them in our last preview of the Georgia game because we wanted to point out why you shouldn't jump on the bandwagon just yet. But are there some things, if it's not their Nick Fitzgerald versus Auburn defense, if it's something else, what is it that can give Mississippi State fans hope? Like if they win this game, what's it going to be because of?
Yeah, I think if they have an area where they can get some advantage, I don't think Auburn is as good on the edges as they have been the past couple of years. I think losing Adams, losing Carl Lawson, really take a chunk out of their ability to set the edge and disrupt on the perimeter. I think Trey Williams, Deshaun Davis are good linebackers. I don't think they're necessarily elite ones. I think Davidson and Holland are good defensive end. I guess one's a buck. I understand that, but good edge players in the line of scrimmage. I don't necessarily think they're elite, and I think they're a little bit small. Carlton Davis is not a huge guy at corner, so I think as much as Mississippi State likes to run on the edges, as much as they run on the quarterback, that's one area they can attack, and that may be one area where they can sort of strain the defense enough to get them out of position to do what they want. But at the end of the day, I do call it like it is, right? I don't try to tell people what they want to hear, and I hope people respect the fact that I try to say things honestly. This isn't a great matchup for Mississippi State because Mullen has been trying to manufacture offense all year through formation and scheme because he doesn't really have the skill position talent to make it work. And Auburn is just solid defensively. So I don't, more so than Georgia, more so than LSU, I don't see them getting out of position. And I do see it sort of being a slow death of running into a brick wall and not really generating much. And frankly, the statistics that we ran in our model generally back that up.
I agree with almost everything you said there, except for the fact that I think Deshaun Davis is borderline elite. Like if he doesn't get drafted highly, I think it'll be because he doesn't have a lot of hype behind him, and I don't think any of that will matter in terms of his NFL career. I think he's an NFL linebacker. I think he's really, really, really good, and he's one of my favorites in the SEC right now. All right. I'm going to go straight in the numbers. That way you can't rebut me and make me look stupid. So we've got a model this week. And for those of you who haven't listened to our Alabama show, and it might make sense since a lot of you are Auburn fans, this is our first week of the year that we're doing computer models. And if you want an explanation of how that works, you're going to have to watch that video because we're going to get right into the numbers on this one. Tell us what the model says. We'll get into your gut and my gut later, but let's just see exactly what the model says about these two teams.
Right. The first thing to note is that Auburn's defensively is just outstanding against the run. They're only giving up 53% of opponent rush averages. That's crazy. That's one of the best numbers we've seen since Alabama the past couple of years has had stuff similar in the 40s and 60s. Auburn is at that mark now. It's very early in the season, so we're not really sure how that goes because sample sizes are so small. I doubt they're going to be able to hold that good of a number, but it's still very, very good, and I think an underrated thing nationally. If you're that good against the rush, you're going to do a lot of good stuff otherwise. Other than that, Auburn's 81% against the pass. That's very good. It's not necessarily elite, so I think their pass defense It's going to be very good against most teams, but it can be beaten, sort of like we saw against Clemson. Mississippi State is right at 90% on both sides of the ball, which is just honestly, that's right at average for an SEC team. You want to be about 90% because you do have games like Louisiana Tech and Georgia Southern that booster your numbers quite a bit. So, what does that sort of turn out to? Well, all told, it's predicting that Auburn is only going to be able to run the ball for about 3.7 yards per carry, but Mississippi State's only going to run it for 3.2. The difference in the game is that Auburn will be able to pass the ball for over 6 yards per attempt, just enough to keep the chains moving. Mississippi State's probably only predicted to pass the ball for about 4.5 yards per attempt, meaning that Auburn gets about 5 yards per play, enough to score 22 points, it predicts. Mississippi State is only predicted to get 3.9 yards per play, which is anemic, and it, not coincidentally predicts that Mississippi State, just like the Georgia game, is only going to score 3 points. So 22-3 is the score prediction spit out by the model.
And I think the Auburn side is maybe a little low, and I think the Miss State side's a little low. For me, I feel like Auburn defensively I've been singing their praises since last year, so I think they're a good defensive unit, but I also think Mississippi State has a little more in the tank than they were able to do against Georgia. I think, like we talked about, how Georgia is a little more athletic and a little more, I don't know, just pure talent driven on the defense, really swallowed them up a little bit. I don't know that Auburn has, as much as I like their secondary, I don't know that they have somebody that's going to keep Donald Gray bottled up all night. So for me, I'm going to give them a few more points. Let's go 17 there for Mississippi State, and I think Auburn's offense comes out of its shell. 27-17 Auburn for me is my score prediction. So you've been, at some point every week, you're the Grim Reaper for a team, and you've been the Grim Reaper 2 weeks in a row for Mississippi State. Does your gut line up with your model, or does it deviate?
It actually does deviate, just not enough. I do think Auburn's, again, their Achilles heel against Clemson was the offensive line. And one thing models often don't do a very good job of, unless, well, really, they just never do a good job of it, is accounting for the fact that specific matchups can have a really big impact depending on scheme. Mississippi State, the reason that I thought, at the beginning of the year, we talked quite a bit about how I thought they were greatly improved, and they are greatly improved, is because of the disruption in the front four. And Auburn's biggest issue, the reason we both going into the season thought we were going to pick Auburn to win the Clemson game, and both flipped our pick the week prior, was that Auburn in the Georgia Southern game, and as it turned out in the Clemson game, really struggled at offensive line. Those two things are not a good combo for Auburn. That's going to create a lot of disruption. I'm not sure how well the offense is going to operate because guys like Simmons can get in the backfield with consistency. I also think, a lot like you, I think Mullen is very good at generating big plays, and I think if you try to just sit back and drop guys into coverage, I think Mullen is smart enough and Fitzgerald is capable enough to generate some points. Now, Fitzgerald may throw some interceptions along the way, but he's got the arm that he's going to take some shots, and they're going to put some shot plays out there that they're going to be able to generate a score too. And that's kind of my opinion. The problem is, all that said, I still think Mississippi State just doesn't have enough horses and enough depth. And I do think Auburn is too consistent defensively. And I think what this ends up looking like is kind of the reverse of the Clemson game, where Auburn generated a little bit of points and Clemson was able to get a couple scoring drives on the board and just sort of keep Auburn at bay. I think the same thing happens reverse here. I think Auburn puts up about 21 points. I think Mississippi State hits maybe one random shot touchdown to somebody like Gray. I'm kind of on board there. And then maybe one or two other scoring drives. And this ends up something like 21-13. We said a lot, and I said in the last video, right, you should go listen to the Alabama Ole Miss video if you want to hear us explain the model, that we trend not to say this is going to be a low-scoring, close game. I actually do think this will be a low-scoring, tough game, and it's mainly just due to the fact that I think Auburn's defense is very, very good. I think Auburn as a team is very underrated. I think Auburn is going to make a lot of teams sort of pay for the laughter they got early in the season over the course of the season. And I think they're going to be a contender probably all the way up into the Alabama game. And I also think Mississippi State is a very good team. I think they just had a run frankly, I think the three best teams in the SEC right now are Alabama, probably Alabama, Georgia, and Auburn in that order. Mississippi State played two of the three in a row. They're going to be fine the rest of the season, but I think Auburn's just a little bit too much for them to handle.
And this is the question that I asked before the LSU game for Mississippi State was, okay, they've got a 3-game stretch here. It's brutal. It's home LSU, at Georgia, at Auburn. You got to feel good if you're Mississippi State that you leave with a win out of one of these. And for most teams, because that's a tough stretch. The problem for them in terms of their psyche, if they do go on to lose to Auburn, is that they got that win first. So, again, what I said 2 weeks ago was, is this a situation where the natives get a little restless because they struggle in this two-game stretch, but we look at, on the backside of this, we look at them getting on a roll and hitting a 9-win season, and I think we're looking right at that, because you're going to tell me your theory about how they're going to might be favored in all these other games except for Alabama, but there's still odds are that they're going to lose one. But I don't know that we're going to see that. And at worst, we're looking, I think, at an 8-4 type season with the potential 9 in a bowl game. That's a really good turnaround from last year. So none of that's happened yet. It's all speculation, but that's why we have this show, so we can talk about it. Auburn's stretch, I mean, it's looking a lot easier than if you look at it on paper beginning of the year. They go after this: Ole Miss, LSU, Arkansas, Texas A&M, Georgia, which you're looking at that and going, God, that's a brutal stretch. But now, I mean, are they going to lose any of those games? I mean, I know we're overly high on Auburn right now, but are they going to lose any of those games?
I don't necessarily think so. I'm with you. I think, the teams in the SEC, frankly, do look down. And I fought that narrative for years because I didn't think it was true. And I think it's not given quite enough credit, because I think Georgia is a much better team than people expected. And once that's appreciated, then people are going to change sort of their perception on the SEC a little bit, because you have another elite team. But outside of that, in the SEC West, I don't see anything out of Arkansas or Texas A&M that scares me. I don't see anything out of Ole Miss that tells me they're going to be a consistent team in the last week of the year when they have no bowl to play for. So, yeah, I mean, I honestly wonder if outside the Alabama game, Kentucky's not the hardest game for Mississippi State. And, I think it's a very, very good possibility that Auburn runs this slate, because LSU doesn't look very good, and I have to pick Auburn against them right now. And again, the Ole Miss, Arkansas A&M, Auburn's just going to be able to run over them. So let's say they lose to Georgia, and Georgia's as good as I think they are. They're a one-loss SEC team going into the Alabama game, which means by definition the Alabama game has to be at worst a play-in for the SEC West slot. So I think this is going to be a very, very good season for both teams. And rightly or wrongly, is going to, I think, change the negative perception of the SEC, because I think Mississippi State, Auburn, and Georgia, all three of them are probably a lot better than people were really realizing a couple weeks ago.
And I think that's why you can't get down on your coach if you're an LSU with Les Miles, or this year Auburn with Gus, because if you're not Alabama or maybe Ohio State, although they're struggling a little bit, you're going to have some turnover year to year, and you're not going to be great, but you want to avoid those massive valleys that lead to a snowball effect in negative recruiting. And Auburn's managed to avoid that of late, and now we're looking at maybe building some momentum and putting a 9 or 10 win spot up. Like, that's really good in a year where the SEC looks like trash, and really a lot of the bigs throughout the country are looking pretty bad. So Auburn fans, just quietly get your wins and don't listen to the people that were ragging you after struggling against Clemson. I think a lot of people would struggle against that offense or defense. So that's it for Auburn and Mississippi State. Again, Alabama's out there. We got 2 others coming this week. Clemson game with Virginia Tech and Georgia Tennessee. We're going to hop over to the East for that. So be sure to check those out. These two, the Bama and the Auburn, the Bama Ole Miss, Auburn, and Mississippi State games comprise our first part of our podcast. We're going to break that up into 2 parts this week. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging with us, and God bless.